Redefining a genre in the gaming industry is not something that happens every day. Back in 1996, Capcom introduced the first ever Resident Evil game and made every gamer experience something that they never experienced before. As the franchise progressed, it aged like a fine wine, so much that even after almost 24 years, fans are still excited about the new Resident Evil games. And while the Resident Evil games worked so well for Capcom, Resident Evil movies somehow didn't work out. Why is it that people love Resident Evil games so much but didn't receive the movies in the same manner? What went wrong? And is the new Resident Evil Netflix show going to change our perspective as a viewer? This is White Paprika, and today we'll discuss why Resident Evil Netflix show might or might not work. First of all, let's talk about why Resident Evil games are an enormous success. The zombie survival theme of the game was mostly focused on the horror genre rather than action. If we take first Resident Evil game for example, the whole game is based in a mansion, which in theory sounds extremely boring. But the game itself says otherwise. Although you are alone, well, for the most part, searching for your way out of the mansion. Now, why is it not as boring as it sounds? Simply because you are the one experiencing it, not as a viewer, but as a player. And with that, you experience the sense of dread, the creepy environment, and even if your character is alone, the game will keep you hooked up because the fate of the character is in your hands. So, it doesn't make a difference if you're alone. You still have to take every possible step to survive. Movies, on the other hand, aren't received by the audience in the same way. I mean, they can be because, first of all, the genre of the movies is more action-packed than horror, unlike the games. You are not the one to decide what the protagonist does. And that is exactly why it is very difficult to keep the viewer engaged for this specific franchise. So following that rule, we see that almost all the time in Resident Evil movies, there are more than one character on the screen. Because that's what a movie is all about. Screenplay, script, dialogues, which becomes a tough job when you have just one subject to work with, a subject who cannot interact with another subject through dialogues. You cannot know what the character is thinking and how he or she is going to solve a certain problem. Meanwhile, in the games, you don't need another person other than for driving the story, because you are the one controlling it, and your actions will lead to a certain result. Take Resident Evil 3 for example. We encounter Nemesis several times, and each time he appears, it is up to the player to decide if they are going to fight him or run away for their life. The presence of Nemesis was enough for a player to poop their pants, and if you were courageous enough to fight him, unlike me, then Nemesis would drop a supply case when you knock him out, containing either health items or very useful weapon parts. These things will help you out in your actual gameplay and will make you efficient while fighting your enemies. Now analyze for a moment how your certain actions change your whole gameplay experience. If you didn't step up and defeated that enemy, circumstances would have been different. In the movies, however, the feel of sheer terror is missing because the character is never alone, and if they are, that is for a very brief amount of time, which always fails to build the tension for viewers. Resident Evil movies in general are hated by most of the Resident Evil fans. And maybe the reason is that the film series missed the most vital part of the franchise, the horror, the terror a player feels while experiencing the game. And that kind of makes sense, as the Resident Evil 5 and 6, being action-centric games rather than horror, didn't do as well as previous games. And then Resident Evil 7 came out. This time, Capcom decided to take a halt on traditional theme of the series and took an approach to make this title pure horror survival, not action horror, just horror survival. Although Resident Evil 7 seems to have mixed reviews from original Resident Evil fans, but overall the game was a huge success. So, if the Resident Evil movies never worked and game franchise is still a fruitful thing, then why does Capcom think it's a good idea to adapt Resident Evil on a small screen? Let's break it down. The details we have so far on the Resident Evil Netflix series suggest that the base of the story revolves around the Wesker family. Two sisters, Jade and Billie Wesker, who are 14 years old siblings, have moved to the new Raccoon City. Now, it isn't clear, but can be assumed that this timeline is set after the events of Raccoon City, and maybe that is why the city is named New Raccoon City. The more time Jade and Billy spend in this town, the more they realize that their father had been keeping dark secrets. Now, honestly, I'm not being able to understand the theme of the show. It sounds like just another suspense thriller show. But wait a second, that is only the first timeline. We have a few more details that advocate that there is another timeline, 26 years later to be precise. And now, there are less than 15 million people left on the planet. At this point, it is starting to feel like The Walking Dead show. But here's a twist. There are more than 6 billion monsters on the planet. Yes, you heard that right, 6 billion, which clearly means that this show is all about survival. And yes, I think some action must be involved too, but I think now it all depends on the execution of the show. Creators really need to set up the tone of the show from the very start. In my opinion, Resident Evil is that kind of a name that is very fragile when it comes to adapting it in live action. And honestly, I don't have too many hopes with this series, but we all know we're going to watch it, right? For the sake of fans, I really wish that this time the live action adaptation turned out to be a good piece of art. But until then, enjoy the great Resident Evil games, because we have Resident Evil 8 Village on the way, for which we are very excited and I shall discuss it very soon. If you liked my video, do leave a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Take care.